The director of this new documentary, Michael Pack, joins us now. Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. And it's pretty amazing. I think this is the most I've ever heard him talk. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me on, Dana.
So this... Go ahead, sorry.
I was just going to respond to the most you've heard him talk. I mean, we wanted to finally give him a chance to tell his story in his own words. His enemies, the left, have been defining it, from before the hearing to today. So this is a chance for him to have his say. And it's based on over 30 hours of interviews I conducted with him and his wife over a 6-month period. And he speaks right to the camera and tells viewers what it's like to go through his very tumultuous life. From that little bit of the trailer, you get a sense of that, and then your description of the hearing as well. And he says it right to camera. So, and it's as you say, it is a very powerful story. It's at one level, it's a great Horatio Alger's story coming from the segregated South and dire poverty to the Supreme Court. On another, it's that kind of coming-of-age story for America that you just outlined, Dana.
Yes, and his story is just amazing to me, and I want to talk about that in a minute, but he does look right at the camera, and there's something about his countenance in this. You would think that most people, because our society encourages it, let's be honest, would be very... in relishing the schadenfreude of having all of your enemies and all of the people who persecuted you be proven so horrifically wrong that it actually created a whole new generation of people who are Republican and who are conservative and who have been brought to share Clarence Thomas's values because of what they saw him endure. And yet he has none of that. He does not have a bit of that in the way he speaks about this, which I think is pretty stunning. That says a lot to his character.
I agree with you. I mean, he talks about how it was his faith for him and his wife, then newly married, to get through the confirmation battle. And even today, he says a prayer for humility, I think daily or near daily. Humility is a virtue in small supply here in the nation's capital, and I think that's one of the things you detect in his dignity and countenance, Dana.
Yeah, very much so, and just very, and he's very warm. Someone who can be very stoic when you see him, when you see clips of or photographs of when they're in the Supreme Court, or when they're watching State of the Union, etc. But he delivers this warmth. I love his life story, and his grandfather is something else. And I knew a little bit about this, a little bit about his backstory even before the documentary came out. But the way that he discusses it, how he kind of had to grow up pretty much immediately, and his grandfather, that harshness and maybe the manner in which he dealt with him. You look back on certain things in your life and you see, okay, I realize why I endured this. It was to prepare me for this. His whole life was to prepare him for that.
I think you're right. I mean, his grandfather, after he went through this period of dire poverty in Savannah, he was hungry, cold in the winter, not even a real bed to sleep in. His mother brought him to her father, his grandfather, to raise when he was about 8 years old. Mm-hmm. And that is what turned his life around. His grandfather had that kind of tough love that you just described, and gave him discipline and taught him the Bible and sent him to parochial schools. And all that training, I think he would say he fell back on his grandfather's values and the values of these Irish nuns through his life, even though he wandered away from it through this period of radicalism that's described at the end of that little clip from the trailer and other things. He finally comes back to it. And then I think you're right. That is what gets him through the as he says, Kafkaesque confirmation battle with the Anita Hill charges. So it is a powerful story. And his grandfather is an unusual character, the kind I think now written out of American history and especially African American history. Both he and Justice Thomas refused to define themselves as victims, even though they could. They're growing up in segregation, in real poverty.
Right.
But that unwillingness to do that and that demand that you take care of yourself and self-reliance is really powerful in both.
Yes, I like the one phrase that he had said about his grandfather when they'd be working from sun up till sundown, and his grandpa would tell him, "All right, well you can you can give out, but you can't give up. And how that really was kind of woven through how he approached everything. How he was saying that when he was in school and studying for tests, and he couldn't get a 98, he had to get 100. He had to be above and beyond on everything because the racism was real, the discrimination was real, the bigotry was real. And I like what he said, I have to get 100. In other words, leave them nothing but race. I thought it was brilliant.
It was a great line, and it did bring back that era. But even though he experienced actual racism, in a lot of today's people asking for reparations, it is their ancestors that experienced it in some sense. But Clarence Thomas has experienced Jim Crow and racism directly, and he doesn't define himself as a victim. In spite of all that, he thinks he's blessed, and and it was all according to God's plan, is how he chooses to see it.
I like that he defines himself not by the things that awful things that I think people would carry around with them in such horrible ways for forever. He doesn't define himself by that, nor does he keep himself to that path. He defines himself by the not just by faith, but by all of the great things that have happened because of his faith and hard work, and which that is very counterculture.
It is. It's a kind of culture that that has harks back to an earlier time. But I want to make sure, if I may, that make sure your listeners can get to the movie. They've got to go to our website, justicethomasmovie.com, where it lists where it's playing. It opened last week in 20. Now it's in 40 theaters. So we hope the momentum builds. If it's not in a theater near you, there's a place on the website to sign up, and if there's a big enough group, we can make an event happen. But I appeal to your listeners to go. Sometimes people, more conservative people, don't bother to go to the movies and see
which is
all
awful.
That
because this is how
I mean,
politics are downstream from culture, and this is where everything that eventually becomes solidified politically or policy wise later on all happens in the for the lack of a better way to say it, the petri dish of culture. I mean, that's where it all starts. And I love that you have him just. Let me ask you this, because, and this might be a weird question. Was it easy to have him tell these stories? Did he? Because he's so stoic, and we're just so. Didn't he go for like a decade without even saying anything when they were doing oral arguments? How was that process?
Well, he doesn't like speaking in oral arguments, and he doesn't like speaking to the media, since he was burned by the media in a big way, of course, during his confirmation battle. He is a great storyteller and likes to tell stories, and so in that sense it was easy. What was difficult is I had to pull him through talking about parts of his life that he doesn't like talking about much, like the Anita Hill part of the hearings and other things, difficulties in his life. And I am honored that he trusted us with all that interview material to make the story to make his story dramatic for viewers, and his wife as well. So it was difficult in some sense and easy in others. But to echo what you said, conservatives especially have to actually buy tickets. I think this is a film that, whatever your politics, you should see it. I went to see RBG about Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but I think surely those that love Clarence Thomas should bring their family and friends and people who don't agree with them,
right,
and actually show up, buy tickets, rather than just complain about the culture.
Yes.
Many people quote that comment of Andrew Breitbart's about politics being downstream from culture,
Dear
but then
friend
they
of
don't
mine.
actually go.
That's right. Exactly.
You have to
Conservatives
buy
are cheap when it comes to culture, Michael. They are.
Indeed.
It infuriates me.
I mean, it is something. It is infuriating. And tickets are not all that expensive as it comes down. When all is said and done. It's cheap, and they just don't want to commit the time and effort. And people on the left back it with both their money and their time.
Yes.
We can too. This is a powerful story. It's not just a lecture by Clarence Thomas on jurisprudence. It's what you described earlier, Dana. It's his very powerful story, and the many twists and turns in his life, which I think do define a lot of the struggles of the 20th century. His going from black radicalism to voting for Reagan was a big journey, and a journey that's revealing a lot about America at that time.
Reagan, the guy who voted for Reagan, I have to interrupt you. The guy who voted for Reagan, who came from culture and cinema, just to put that out there. And can you imagine if Reagan had not gone through that path and not been where he was, how that would have affected Clarence Thomas? So, yes, going and participating in culture and seeing movies is important.
That's right. You wouldn't have to convince Ronald Reagan of that. That is very true. he knew it in his bones.
Yeah. Well, the movie is
and that's right.
Yeah, justicethomasmovie.com, and Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. People need to go and see this, and I think that one of the biggest things that I love is that everyone always thinks that silent strength is somehow a compromise of a fighting spirit. And in fact, I think that is the evidence of the most warrior of spirits, is to have that silent strength and to know when to punch and when not to. And he's just demonstrated that so well. I think he's an American icon, and this is just so beautifully done. Michael Pack with Manifold Productions, the brains behind this. You've all done a splendid job with it, and we thank you for bringing the story to us in his words.
Thank you, Dana. I appreciate that, and I hope your listeners do go. And it's an inspiring story, and bring young people too, I would say.
Yes, bring young people. I think young people particularly need to see this. I think it should be put in schools, honestly. justicethomasmovie.com. Go, get your tickets. It's so easy.